Good evening. This presentation will be about the U.S. involvement in World War II. Why did the United States get involved in a country halfway around the world? That's part of the question you'll be able to answer today. So don't forget, first you need to watch the video without looking at the notes, so turn your paper over. Step 2, look at your notes, so flip your paper back over and see what you remember. See what you can fill in without watching again. This will help you know what you need to study later on. Step 3, you need to watch the video again and pause it periodically as you complete the notes. And here we go. There was a gradual change in American policy from neutrality to involvement. If you remember, neutrality means that America is staying neutral. They're not choosing a side. But eventually they do become directly involved in the war and help the Allies in the war effort. American isolationism was a legacy from World War I. If you remember, in World War I, it begins in 1914, but America does not join until 1917, when they were directly threatened by the Central Powers. Okay, this is a legacy from World War I, and then after World War I, they go back to this policy of isolationism. So if you look at the cartoon over here, you can see Uncle Sam in the snow saying, "Let me alone, it's so peaceful," whereas Nazism is kind of pelting him with the snow, representative of the Axis powers, seeing if they can force him to get involved. Isolationism is just defined as a policy of remaining apart from the affairs or interests of other groups. Okay. This means that the U.S. is going to remain alone. They're not going to pick and choose sides. They're not going to help one side over the other. They're not going to get involved in a war that is currently taking place halfway around the world. And we'll look at in a moment how they get directly involved. So even though the U.S. is proclaiming this policy of isolationism, they begin to give economic aid to the Allies. They're not giving direct soldiers to fight, but they're giving economic help to the Allies, who are just coming out of the Great Depression as well, and they can use as much help as they need. They call this program the Lend-Lease program. So in March 1941, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed sales or loans to any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the U.S. So if you remember, Franklin Roosevelt is president during this time period, and he is allowed to choose who he is going to support in the war effort. So if you go back to the previous slide, you can see President Franklin Roosevelt here with Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is a leader of Great Britain, and he is going to help. There are many things that the U.S. could sell or loan to a country who needed help. Most of the time it was lending items. And so in exchange for military supplies like warships, canned food, any kind of supply, Great Britain leased military bases in Bermuda and the Caribbean to the U.S. Because remember, they're coming off the Great Depression, so they don't necessarily always have cash to pay for these items. So what they do is lease these military bases instead, so that the United States has more opportunities for bases around the world. Finally, the U.S. becomes directly involved in the war. And what finally forces them to get involved is what happens next. There were rising tensions developing between the United States and Japan throughout the whole time that the Lend-Lease program is taking place, and also because of Japanese aggression in the Pacific Ocean. First, Japan invades Manchuria and China and starts to conquer that territory. Because remember, the goal of the Axis powers is to take over the whole world. It also invades French Indochina, which is present-day Vietnam, which is another region rich in resources. Japan is an island nation, does not have very many natural resources, and as a result, they need to take over other lands in order to gain those natural resources. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor Navy base in Hawaii without any advanced warning. They flew in and bombed the ships early on a Sunday morning, and here you can see a map of the layout of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Japan sunk and damaged many U.S. Navy ships, and approximately 2,400 Americans died in that attack. Finally, President Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Because the U.S. was under a direct attack, it was now time for action and direct involvement. No more neutrality or isolationism or lend-lease. It's time for the U.S. to get directly involved in the war. President Roosevelt said on December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941 is a date which will live in infamy. That means it will be famous for a bad reason. We will remember it for a terrible tragedy, not because it was famous for a good reason, but because it was famous for a disappointing reason. The U.S. officially declares war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. Congress approves President Roosevelt's proposal. After the U.S. declares war on Japan, Germany turns around and declares war on the United States, which puts the U.S. directly involved into this war. Please answer the final question on your homework sheet, which again is your own opinion, but make sure you meet the sentence requirement. And we will continue to discuss why the United States became directly involved in the war in more detail in class. But come to class prepared with your notes completed. This flipped homework completed is your notes, so that you are ready to discuss and continue on with the learning in class. Have a great evening.